All right. I end up voting negative in this debate on the ableism stuff. I think that the way that the cross-examinations answer to what it means to be blind makes it very difficult for you to make some of the other arguments that exist in the debate. When blindness becomes something like not thinking through things and not being able to understand things, it's not just the question of visibility versus invisibility that you seem to then focus on, but it's a question of the way that you utilize the language of blindness, which is language that gets utilized again in the 2AC when you continue to use that language. And then you do stop using it come the 1AR and the 2AR, but I think that at that point there's links to why these things become problematic. I think Ben Moshe evidence, while it says invisibility, it is not using it in a negative derogatory sense in the way that it gets defined after the way blindness gets defined after the cross-examination. So I think that there's a distinction between blindness as being negative and the question of if one is visible or invisible. I think that the stuff that I spend a lot of time thinking about is the first is the question of coalitions, and you say that one of the prerequisites of coalitions is the ability to become visible. And if the way that the affirmative goes about promoting these forms of coalitions in order to be able to engage with other people does something that then becomes an exclusionary act that causes other people to not become part of it, it becomes difficult to see how those coalitions could formulate if you use language that would then push people who are blind out, because it says being blind means that you can't think through or understand these sort of things. I think that potentially a formalized permutation on this flow would be useful in this regard, so that way it becomes something that you can utilize. I also think that having in the 2AR a direct conversation about the role of the ballot would be useful, and how the role of the ballot would operate in this round in regards of, like they say, best ethical orientation towards oppression. And there's certainly a lot of things that they do discursively that becomes fucked up, that becomes the reasons for why I think that they could be rejected, and I would like to see that connected back to the role of the ballot for why their orientation towards oppression is one that is bad and ends up recreating a lot of these other forms of violences that take place. I think that poetics, while people who are disabled are able to use poetics as a way to write themselves into existence, is not necessarily a defense of the affirmatives metaphors they could utilize in the debate. Just because people could utilize poetry in a way to write themselves into existence doesn't mean that the way that poetry or language is utilized by the affirmative is something that's beneficial or not beneficial in that regard. I think that the best argument that you have in the 2AC that I think you should be going for is your congregate textuality argument, for where they're focused on just the text and things that you say suddenly become a reason to reject you, instead of being able to focus on the entirety of the performance, where it becomes that sort of like we're targeting just a single word or something like that there, because that is a direct answer to the things that they're talking about. And I think that argument I don't have a really good response to in the 1 hour, outside of its nitpicking, but its nitpicking becomes a situation where it's nitpicking based upon things of text opposed to things that are actually that are done more concretely. And I think that would be the best answer that I would very readily be able to vote on in this regards. There are some things that I think become semi-contradictory in the way that I hear them articulated in the 2AR, such as you don't do anything outside of yourselves that is only for a value for yourselves, but then the immediate follow-up sentence is something that is along the lines of this is essential for other people in order to be able to create survival strategies that other people could then utilize or model, that we create educations, we could be able to create coalitions. So there are definitely parts of your speech where you are creating value that is beyond just the two of you and your individual survival, which makes it being more than just about what happens for the two of you within this round. And also, in regards of I don't think the punishment paradigm is the best thing for you to be going here, because I think that using a punishment paradigm against some of the things that they do would be a beneficial model in this debate, that we should strike down people who do and say things that are offensive. If that's true and that's the world that they're trying to create, then that also becomes a reason for why they should be punished for some of the parallels that they make in regards to what you're doing in this debate. And I think that is something beneficial. I do think that the Ben Moshe evidence and some of the other evidence that they read in the debate explains why that remaining critical of utilizing ableist language within educational forums is is essential prerequisite in order to be able to allow for the forms of coalition and participation that's necessary. Otherwise, it just becomes a exclusionary act that ends up being violent. I also think at the same time that that the evidence that you read about is the evidence that you read that indicates the fairy evidence. It talks about that we need to have a sustained interaction between conversations of race and ableism. I think is a good card because it shows that there needs to be a sustained interaction between those two sort of things, which is both good and problematic in this round. I think it's good because it's something that they are not necessarily doing because they do not have a sustained conversation about race within their strategy, but bad because you don't necessarily have a sustained conversation about ableism in your strategy as well, which is why I think a permutation would be the best way to be able to resolve these things, because then you could be like, we are explicitly being able to bring these two things together in order to be able to have it as a tethering strand. The evidence is really good about explaining how blackness has also been posed as a disability in order to sustain things like whiteness. And so if those conversations become explicit throughout and then there's a way to bring these things together, then that becomes something that even in the world where the textual language is used becomes problematic, then bringing that into the dialogue becomes something that is beneficial. And I think that that evidence can be utilized to structure a permutation. So instead of just being like their analogy ignores glosses over other forms of oppression, it's net benefit of including these criticisms within the 1AC is something that is going to be useful and beneficial.
I have a question specifically about that. How do you not evaluate the argument when we say that like blackness is already considered a disability, right? So when we open these spaces for discussion of, I don't know, the disability in the space, right? It creates a type of education via the coalition, right? Like, so the coalitions we create have discussions about disability, right? And the impacts to that, right? How is that not, I guess, like a combination of the poetry from the ad and a discussion about like the implications of this disability?
Well, I think that,
Like,
I think that, for instance, like your use of blindness becomes something that would shut down that coalition because it makes an exclusionary space. So you don't have a coalition that would allow for the discussion for people who are blind, right?
That. But they also say that it's because of visibility, and we say that it's not that like blindness creates like invisibility or visibility per se. It's the fact that like when you present poetry in a space, right? It's the actual poetry that you present that creates a visible like body, right? It's the poetry that becomes visible, not the body, right?
Right, but you say that the problem with being blind is because it causes you not to think through things, right? That's a cross-examination, right? So it's not just that you make things visible, it's that being blind is bad.
So how did that jive with the argument that like we didn't explicitly, I don't know, designate that upon a blind person, right? Like we didn't explicitly mean that.
Right, I mean, the evidence that they're reading is very good about talking about how utilizing metaphors of blindness, which then you define very concretely in cross-examination as being not thinking through anything or having these forms of analysis, becomes a very sort of explicit way where you do that.
All right,
right?
so in a world where we're winning that like, I don't know, the institutions are the root cause of that, right? And we say that a pathologization argument that like once we begin to rethink a coalitional strategy that attacks the institution that causes the impacts of that, right? And once we attack the institution, it resolves all those impacts.
Right, but that assumes that you get to the coalition. If I think that you break down that coalition because you don't allow for blind people or people with disabilities to participate because the language that you're using is exclusionary, that pushes that out. They create a framing issue where they say that this operates as a different level of everything else because it's a question of the words that we choose and the language that we operate, which then gets to the role of the ballot for why that language then becomes fundamentally unethical.
So if the internal link is that we break down coalitions, right, and their card concludes that once we stop using the word, right, the impacts no longer matter because once we stop using the word, we realize the word is bad, we open a space for discussion, right? After the 2AC, we stopped using the word, right? So in a world where that's true, and we internal link turn the argument, right? Like, why would that break down coalitions?
Well, I don't think that you necessarily internal link turn the argument, like, because I think that the use of that word when you start your coalitional strategy by utilizing metaphors of blindness as a way that is associated with negativity stops the ability for you to be able to get access to your internal link turns to be able to solve for those institutional structures.
Doesn't the card say that like once we stop using the word though, that begins to change? Doesn't it say that?
Well, I just have where in the 2AC did you have them using that as a metaphor? I know I said the word and like reference to answering it, but like where did I actually use that as like a?
I have it when you get to the net benefits of of poetry, with like the reasons for why poetry is good, for how it allows us to be able to see things.
What I just
right.
don't remember exactly what I said. I'm just trying to figure out what I had said because I just don't remember.
Yeah, so net benefit of poetry is uniquely good. A, is allows for visibility because we see the ways in which we can engage in politics. And then you extend the Moulton evidence to talk about engagement, which uses the idea of sight as being a positive way of being able to see the truth for us to be able to then take political action, which is the flip of blindness doesn't allow us to be able to see the ways oppression operates. Right? So you continue to use seeing or vision as a metaphor of something that is positive, and poetry allows us to see these things.
How is that different than like their metaphor of invisibility in their like?
Or we drop the argument that we make, that say that like certain inevitabilities just will happen, right? Like how the language of your authors is the same language that we use, right? That was a uniqueness framing at the top of the
Right. I think that that evidence is not using blindness and sight in the way that you two do it. I think it's a different usage. Like when they do not say things like blindness means that we cannot think through political consequences. Seeing things is the only way that we can understand these sort of things, which means I don't think that their evidence that uses the word invisibility is the same way that you two employ it. And I think that it's mostly, the most explicit part is the way that you define it after cross-examination of the 1AC.
So do you give weight to the argument that blackness is a disability? No?
Yes. I mean, like blackness is disability. We should talk about these things in connection to one another. Fine. I don't think that necessarily wins you. I don't think that's a independent reason to win you the round, because you don't necessarily have the sustained conversation that allows for us to be able to challenge those forms of language that recreates that would break down coalitions for people who are blind as an identity, because blindness becomes a metaphor for you. Right? And so that's what their evidence is speaking to, is when blindness gets used as a metaphor as opposed to an identity, it means that people who actually are blind are unable to participate or feel excluded within these coalitions. And with your emphasis on coalitions being important, that becomes a reason for why it's difficult for me to see how you're able to positively move in the directions that you want to challenge things like blackness, because if blackness is also a disability, it requires a conversation of ableism. If you construct ableism, that makes it sort of difficult for you to orient your things, orient against that.
So that leads me to my last question. Okay, so in a role that's true, like you said, that's true, right? How do you evaluate the argument that I made that like they still put violence into the debate space because there actually is not someone in this literal debate round that's blind, right? So you literally have, I don't know, like targeted blind people who are not even in this space, right?
Because they're excluded.
Collapse of coalitions, right? Because like, I mean, there are no blind people in the round to exclude from the coalition. Right.
Well, a prerequisite to get them into a round is creating a space that they feel safe within, right? In the same way that a prerequisite to getting black participation into coalitions is creating a space where you could feel safe participating within, right? There needs to be a safe space for bodies to be able to enter into these.
I just don't hear that argument as an answer to the argument I just made.
Right, but they are making the arguments that you would stop that from taking that you would stop the ability for people with disabilities to be able to be in these places because it's exclusionary.
But that was predicated off the pathologization argument, right? Like how they just likened my life to a movie, right? Like that was a spin-off, right? Like how they can bring that type of violence into the space, but at the same time say that we're being ableist against disabled people who are not even here. Right, like that was a pathologization. How you can blame me, right, for what the institution does, right? The victim blaming stuff.
Right, but I don't see that institution. Like I get the victim blaming in relationship to the UC Berkeley evidence and the way in which the whites will then take that stuff. I think that that's a different question than the ableist rhetoric that you utilize.
Both were there, is what you're saying. You just.
I think that there is a distinct. Like I don't see, because you say blind is not seen, that therefore that is victim blaming because it's what whites will do or the way the institutions will utilize that rhetoric, because I see it as a way that you are actively utilizing the rhetoric in the way that they're criticizing it, which is different than saying because you spoke or because you performed your identity, therefore it took place. So I think it's different. I think though, with that pathologization argument, I think that connected to the role of the ballot conversation. I think that would, because that is what I also spend time thinking about, is I think that having that conversation in relationship to the role of the ballot when there's only that single role of the ballot, and then phrasing it in that way would be a way to sort of be able to leverage that impact in a way that would prioritize them as what they're doing as being a unethical action, which means that my ballot should be oriented against that. But when they're explaining the role of the ballot in the 2NR, they're explaining the role of the ballot as a way in which we have to be able to change the discourses and the language that we use in terms of word choices in order to be able to orient a better educational space that would be structured against oppression. And I think that there is certainly room for you to reinterpret that role of the ballot, but I think you need to have that actual discussion in that debate round. This is what I think. Yeah. I think that you two make the right decision on going for the ableism versus the speciesism arguments in this round. It's not because you did a bad job on speciesism per se, but I think that you two had good answers to speciesism and debated it well throughout the debate. I think that 1AR time allocation, you know, I was going to say that I think that you should have more time in speciesism in the 1AR because I thought that that's what they would probably end up going for, knowing who I am as a judge. But I think that given the way the round went down, that would be, you didn't necessarily have a bad time allocation, but that's only because they went for that. I think, though, that having a direct answer to the role of the ballot in that 1AR would be useful because then you could be able to frame that on there as well. So, like, I get you starting with the you can't resolve psychic violence and those sort of stuff, opposed to being like, we'll either spot you this role of the ballot and this is why we capture it better, or here's our counter role of the ballot, because that's sort of going to frame how I'm going to approach the round if there's no discussion of that. So I think having that as an explicit conversation that emerges in the 1AR would be useful. And then it'll also be able to give the 2AR more leeway for me to be able to weigh some of the arguments that he's asking me about in relationship to that. Because for me as a judge, if there is a role of the ballot and only one team is making analysis on that role of the ballot, that is going to structure sort of how I will approach the debate. And when that role of the ballot is constructed on the way that of the language choices that we're using and stuff like that, there needs to be some sort of direct conversation or interaction with that explicitly.
Do you think if we had run first cryptocentrism, we would have won?
Almost definitely. Because I don't think there's really any good answer to cryptocentrism outside of their argument about, well, nitpicking is problematic, but I don't think that gets at this cryptocentrism because it ignores all the other things that are going at there. So I think that was the best argument that you had. That was really good on that. And then another thing that you could potentially do with that scriptocentrism argument is make arguments about the way in which language is used and is controlled by white Eurocentrism, which means when language gets utilized as a way to say that this is what it means, it becomes a problematic aspect for dealing with people, people who are black, and dealing with you, like for me to say that this is how this language is defined, and this is what it meant when you said that it means that you can't see these sort of forms of oppression, creates a form of white linguistic violence of taking control of that form of language. And I think that could emerge onto the scriptocentrism stuff that also shows that why a conversation of ableism becomes not a real conversation of how do we make debate accessible, but just becomes, well, you said a word which doesn't necessarily have anything to do with, how do we get to these debate rooms? How do we get to places and like other forms of institutional inaccessibility that you're going to be more addressing? So I think that you could potentially pull back from some of like discourse, language matters, poetry, and go to more towards like institutionality, and then their focus on that scriptocentrism ignores the institutional things that makes debate spaces inherently exclusionary beyond just sort of language choices that we use in this round.
Yep.
It is also a low point win because I think that the metaphors that you're using and the way that you characterize them are, offensive. They are certainly offensive to them, which is the bright line for me. If you offend the other team, then it is offensive, right? And I understand how you don't necessarily mean it that way, but it is being heard that way. And when you two are saying things like, well, they could have just apologized, you don't ever apologize for your shit either, right? And you offend them with your stuff, which means that if you think an apology is important, this is a pretty opportune time to issue an apology in that world, and then explain what you meant. But you should start with, hey, I'm sorry. If I'm sorry is all they needed to say to get out of your ableism link, right? And so even if you don't mean it that way, it's being heard that way. And if you're making arguments that people don't get to be in control of their own language because of the way it gets utilized or heard by others, that means that you should have a realization that what you're saying, even if it's not being meant that way, it is definitely being heard that way, which is all the arguments that you're making in the 2NR about how this language becomes problematic and how at the SAE is like, oh, well, they didn't really mean to be racist and stuff like that. I'd be like, no, it doesn't matter if they didn't mean it. It was just a joke. It clearly is being, heard this way by people within that community. And so I think that there's a conversation of that in the 2AR in relationship to roles of in relationship to the role of the ballot and things like that. I think could also have lost due ground. So I think that you should certainly be careful about that in the future and the sort of metaphors that you utilize. And I think that, if someone gets offended in future rounds, you should get outside of debate mode and be like, I'm sorry that what I said offended you. I didn't mean that way, and then make a different argument instead. So, any other questions?
Can I ask one question?
Mm-hmm.
If that's true, that you agree in the discourse argument, when they make the argument that discourse is the same as the role of the ballot essentially issue, then isn't that the same violation then? I mean,
The words roll of the ballot don't come out
so
of
it's more the explicit.
connection of how it is, because they're saying explicitly that this roll of ballot is contextualized between specific word choices that are utilized, that here's the way that blindness operates, not so much that someone is offended, but when these metaphors of ableism has them. So that's why I'm saying that for me, if there's a roll of the ballot and only one team's contextualizing it, it's difficult for me to figure out how to frame a ballot in opposite direction, which is why if there's a reframing of that ballot in terms of like how that could be understood and why they should be rejected for these sort of things, even if it's not about a specific line. And that works perfectly with the scriptocentrism stuff, right? Because they point out a word, but the affirmative is pointing out sort of the entire ethos of a presentation, that becomes a reason for why that could be, the scriptocentrism works with a reinterpretation of the roll of ballot that would get me to sort of vote affirmative. So I think that either...
it was there, they just didn't make the connection.
Right, and so like when the only people who contextualize how I should approach the round is the negative, it's difficult for me to take these arguments and then apply it within that sort of world, and that is some of the things that I end up spending time on there doing. And so I think either scriptocentrism or recontextualization of role of the ballot are the two different ways that the affirmative and the 2AR gets my ballot. So, yeah.
Can I get the SD card for the?
It's gonna post it
Yes.
online.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just get it real quick just to make sure. So-
Okay.